Rainbow Six Siege is a game that's had a rather interesting journey with ups and downs along the way. Many will remember the rough launch that the game experienced due to a general lack of maps, characters, and content, unreliable servers, and noticeable graphical UB downgrades, among other things. But throughout the last few years, the game has evolved into something of a powerhouse, thanks to Ubisoft Montreal's commitment toward supporting the game through the rough patches, managing to make what's arguably one of the greatest comebacks in gaming. The amount of content in the game is now comprehensive, servers have seen a revamp for the better, gameplay has seen a wide variety of refinements, and the developers' unwillingness to give up on the game has paid off, with the tactical shooter having garnered a growth worth tens of millions of players since launch. Now, with that success also came the need for publisher Ubisoft to revisit the pricing model for the game's various editions by jacking up prices and to push monetization schemes further, resulting in loot boxes, or packs as they're known in this game, being added earlier this year. The jacked up prices and the addition of loot boxes felt like an unfortunate blemish in an otherwise stellar experience. Now, a more recent point of contention stemmed from some decisions that Ubisoft made in order to tailor Rainbow Six Siege to the Chinese market. On November 2nd, 2018, Ubisoft released a blog post on their official website detailing some of the aesthetic changes that will be coming to the game for next season in light of preparations to push the game into Asian territories, namely China. Here's what they had to say. We are currently working towards preparing Rainbow Six Siege for expansion into Asian territories. As such, there will be some adjustments made to our maps and icon to ensure compliance. None of these changes will have an impact on gameplay. We have examples of these changes at the bottom of the blog. A single global version. We want to explain why these changes are coming to the global version of the game as opposed to branching and maintaining two parallel builds. We want to streamline our production time to increase efficiency. By maintaining a single build, we are able to reduce the duplication of work on the development side. This will allow us to be more agile as a development team and address issues more quickly. We want to be future-proof. Having the same people working on a singular global version of the game ensures we only need to do the work once. In addition, we can guarantee that any future changes are aligned with the global regulations we are working towards. We will not change the core of the game. We have a commitment to ensure that the Rainbow Six Siege experience remains true to its roots. We are adjusting art and visuals, but are not compromising what makes Rainbow Six Siege the game you know today. The blog post then proceeded to show some of the aesthetic changes players can expect moving forward in light of recent developments. First up, we are shown how the melee icon has been changed from a knife symbol to a fist symbol, and how the death icon was changed from symbols featuring skulls to a symbol simply featuring a man with an X across his chest. Below that, there is a before and after image showing a graffiti that once featured a skull but now simply shows a masked man instead. In this next comparison, not only is the imagery of skulls removed, any signs of slot machines are completely missing as well due to suggestions of gambling, which is ironic when you consider Rainbow Six Siege eventually added gambling-like monetization features via packs. Next up, here we can see how a simple bloodstain was removed outright, and finally, we are shown how this suggestive neon sign of a stripper has been altered to be less explicit. Basically, what we're looking at here is Ubisoft's attempt to pull a 4Kids in order to appeal to Asian markets, China in particular, and also to comply with the regulations regarding what visual elements are allowed to be shown in games in that country. Unsurprisingly, the Rainbow Six community wasn't too happy to learn of any of this, with many expressing that what was being done here was downright censorship, which, well, yeah, that's exactly what this is. While alterations to visual elements hardly ruin the game, and while this is hardly the end of the world, the notion that a game should lose bits of its flavor, that it should lose pieces of its creative integrity, or that it should tailor to a specific country's censorship laws across the board does indeed set a very dangerous precedent. There is no denying that there is a huge rush right now for game publishers to get their games out to the goldmine that is China. And we have already seen how games across the board have changed as a result of some kind of gold rush. When microtransactions and loot boxes became lucrative, the very nature of games and their business model underwent drastic changes to maximize monetization. And now, with releasing games in China becoming the next big push, one has to wonder how far game publishers will go and how our games will be affected for the sake of leveraging the Chinese market, for the sake of complying with their laws. Just look at what's happening with Diablo Immortal, a game that Blizzard co-founder Alan Adam announced would not have a mature rating, which goes against what Diablo as a franchise creatively stands for. It's supposed to be a series with mature themes.
It's about the maturity of the content. The Diablo Immortal for the mobile device is being designed so that everybody can play it from all ages. And so where some of the PC products are mature rated, our goal is that this will not be mature rated.
I can only surmise that a big part of that decision had to do with the same reasons Ubisoft attempted to censor some of the more mature visual elements in Rainbow Six Siege to comply with China's game policies on what's deemed acceptable for release. If businesses want to dip their toes into the Chinese market, that's fine, but it's a whole other thing to let that influence the artistic merit of games across all regions in that pursuit. That right there is a slippery slope worth calling out, which is exactly what gamers did. The best solution would have been to create a separate sanitized version of the game for China, but Ubisoft's excuse for not doing so essentially bogged down to it's cheaper and easier, which is never a good justification for downgrading your products or for anti-consumer practices. Fortunately, after much backlash, Ubisoft did eventually reverse their decision, as announced in a blog post posted on the official website 18 days later on November 20th, 2018. The post expressed how after much behind-the-scenes discussions within the team, they wanted to ensure that the experience for all their players, especially those who have been with the game from the beginning, remains as true to the original artistic intent as possible. Though it was noted that this reversal may lead to the next season being delayed and may result in a shorter time frame to test and debug upcoming seasonal changes. Ultimately, I do think Ubisoft made the right call here, and I think players had good reason to speak out against an issue that, while not immediately earth-shattering, may have adverse long-term effects down the line if not called out now. Game publishers have proven time and again that if we give them so much as an inch, they will take a mile, so we shouldn't grant them so much as an inch of leeway with this attempt at censorship. Now, one journalist, James Batchelor from Games Industry, doesn't see it that way, having published an article the day after Ubisoft announced that they'll be reversing the aesthetic changes to Rainbow Six Siege, with a headline that suggests that the publisher is pandering to unreasonable players by giving in. Apparently, the precedent of game companies listening to customers who buy their products is more unwanted than the precedent that companies will neuter aspects of their products' creative merits to the whims of one country or region's market. Apparently, customers complaining and getting what they want is worse than censorship from China seeping into games globally because that's more financially lucrative for corporations. The article then begins by talking about how backlash against a game often occurs from a vocal minority, how saying that the community raising concerns about the recent censorship was putting it mildly, citing things like how Rainbow Six Siege was review bombed on Steam following the censorship announcement, and suggested how making minor aesthetic adjustments to the game globally for a Chinese release wasn't a big deal. He then proceeded to talk about how he can't understand how these minor changes could possibly affect one's enjoyment of the game, and touted how this censorship would allow Ubisoft to get the title into China, and in turn allow Ubisoft to grow as a company, and for the player base to grow with it. Yeah, well, I as a consumer frankly don't give a rat's ass about Ubisoft's growth, especially when a large part of that is being achieved with less than ideal monetization practices and attempts to censor aspects of our games. Sure, as I said before, the initially planned censorship for Rainbow Six Siege wasn't earth-shattering. It wasn't something as extreme as the example provided here about how Ubisoft didn't change the art style of the game to resemble My Little Pony or something like that. But that's like excusing Star Wars Battlefront 2 because EA didn't physically hold you at gunpoint and asked for all your money. Just because this isn't the most extreme form of censorship doesn't make the idea of downgrading a game's visual flavor to tailor to one country's censorship laws ideal. But this guy doesn't seem to get that, as despite acknowledging how such modifications would adhere to censorship of the Chinese government, he shrugged it all off as, what's the big deal? He then talked about how Ubisoft reversing their decision in light of backlash has given review bombers a victory, raising fears that review bombers will begin to influence the course of our games, and then went off on a tangent on how Pokemon Let's Go was review bombed because it was a more casual take on the series. Look, I for one happen to think that review bombing is in no way an ideal response to any unfavorable situation, and I also happen to think that the Pokemon Let's Go games are harmless since Nintendo announced that a mainline entry was in the works to be released next year. But to generalize dissenting players as mindless review bombers, to cherry pick the worst reactions and put that up on a pedestal while ignoring reasonably conveyed concerns is why the rift between journalists and gamers continues to widen. Nobody's saying that there aren't toxic and unproductive responses to stuff like this, but they certainly do not represent gamers as a whole. The toxic crowd is just noise, while plenty of others put forth tangible and reasonable complaints, and Ubisoft listening to that feedback and responding to it in kind isn't setting some dangerous expectation or whatever, but rather that's what more companies should do. Value and listen to your core customers, because that is ultimately good for perception and good for business. It honestly baffles me that the notion of game companies listening to players is being stigmatized by news outlets like these, as if we're supposed to pay for our games and then just eat everything we're served without questioning anything. The article then briefly shifts the conversation to talk about Diablo Immortal and the backlash against that, linking to another dreadful games industry article published by Christopher Dring with the headline, "How to Handle Entitled Gamers When Announcing a Mobile Game." This article essentially demonized gamers for their reaction to the Diablo Immortal announcement while defending Blizzard's baffling decision to make a Diablo mobile game the centerpiece of an event primarily attended by a crowd that could not be less interested in such a product. Apparently, gamers are to blame for being baffled at Blizzard, while Blizzard gets a pass on completely misjudging their audience. Anyway, the whole point of bringing up Pokemon Let's Go and Diablo Immortal seems to be to suggest that what's going on with Rainbow Six Siege is similar in that these are all games facing backlash for trying to appeal to a wider audience, but that is entirely misleading. With Pokemon Let's Go and Diablo Immortal, at least we can take solace in knowing that these are completely separate projects from mainline entries that are currently in development, but the issue with Rainbow Six Siege is that Ubisoft tried to affect the mainline game on a global scale. They tried to make China's censored version of Rainbow Six Siege everyone's version of Rainbow Six Siege, and that precedent was primarily what people were up in arms against. But God forbid we raise concerns because according to this article, companies should be able to do whatever they want and should never have to keep consumers happy at the expense of their business strategy, because business strategy is what they should prioritize first and foremost. It then tries to appeal for Ubisoft by highlighting how the company could avoid additional workload into making a separate version of Rainbow Six Siege for China if gamers would just shut up about the aesthetic changes. Yep, we are apparently supposed to feel sorry that poor, pitiful, multi-billion-dollar corporation Ubisoft has to put extra effort and resources in to potentially rake in billions from China. But cursed be gamers for not wanting to submit to the idea of games' visual flavor being diluted and censored globally because multi-billion-dollar corporation Ubisoft can't be bothered to invest resources into an endeavor to keep censorship isolated. Moving on, the article talks about how bemoaners are fighting against change and how publishers being afraid to upset fans will cause them to take fewer risks and for the gaming industry to stagnate. Once again, a misleading statement. There's good change in the industry and then there is bad change. Gamers encourage the good and admonish the bad. It's plain and simple. Nobody's complaining about the incredible creative and technical strides that gaming has made over the past 2 decades. Nobody's complaining about achievements with titles such as God of War, Spider-Man, and Red Dead Redemption 2. What we are complaining about is rampant monetization, which has progressed rapidly to the detriment of the medium as a whole. The focus on monetization, more than anything, is what has most contributed to the creative stagnation of our games these days, which is why annual releases like FIFA and sports titles in general have seen such half-assed upgrades or regressions year on year. It's why we've seen games be built around microtransactions and turned potentially fantastic experiences into drab affairs. I'm all for change, I'm all for the industry evolving, but the direction it's currently headed in is far from ideal from a consumer perspective. And look, don't get me wrong, the highs are some of the highest we have ever seen in gaming history. but the lows are also some of the lowest, and it's hard not to wonder what some of these beloved games and franchises that have been thoroughly marred by publishers' obsession with monetization could have been. The article finally concluded by going off on a tangent about The Last Jedi, which contributes absolutely nothing to this conversation, before talking about how it was EA and BioWare who set the oh-so-horrific precedent of companies listening to their customers by modifying the ending to Mass Effect 3 after widespread backlash. Because of course, BioWare and EA did nothing wrong by advertising how every decision made in the Mass Effect trilogy matters, and how these decisions will determine the outcome of our epic journeys, before giving us half-assed endings that came down to choosing a color. But God forbid so-called entitled gamers complain about how they felt cheated by the fact that a creative endeavor they were financially and emotionally invested in didn't deliver on what was constantly promised. You've got to wonder how articles like these get released and it's YouTubers who get labeled provocateurs. It's one thing to try to present the corporate angle to a story and try to provide some nuance to the conversation, but it's a whole other thing to blow smoke up corporations' asses while downplaying tangible concerns from gamers, who journalists tend to generalize as these wild, mindless bunch. Fortunately, one journalist who saw games industry's article for the nonsensical crap that it was is Eric Kane from Forbes, who published a direct counter-argument article 2 days later on November 13th, 2018. His headline says it all. No, Ubisoft didn't pander to entitled gamers over Rainbow Six Siege censorship. One of the first things he emphasized is the fact that China is an authoritarian state with an extensive history of crimes against humanity and restrictions of many freedoms, and there is definitely something disturbing about seeing Western companies willing to let this kind of influence seep into our games because it's easier to make money that way. Beyond that, the Forbes article also described how some of the aesthetic changes in Rainbow Six Siege does in fact impact gameplay, contrary to Ubisoft's claims. The quote that was highlighted was from another Forbes editor, Joe Parklock, who was labeled as a Rainbow Six Siege specialist, and he had the following to say. The proposed changes would have radically changed not only aesthetics, but also map readability and lines of sight for the sake of a market nobody knows will be successful for Siege. The most obvious example of this was in the Clubhouse map, as the removal of slot machines with nothing added in their place also removed a popular spot for hiding drones and gadgets, radically changing the meta of that map. So, to the games industry journalist who clearly didn't play much of the game and dismissed the potential impact these aesthetic changes could have, there you go. The Forbes article then proceeded to express how ridiculous it is to stigmatize the precedent that game companies should listen to consumer feedback, how ridiculous it is to blame gamers for Blizzard's failing to communicate and to read the room of their own marquee fan celebration event when they announced Diablo Immortal, and how ridiculous it is to defend corporations from their consumer base as if we're supposed to feel sorry for the likes of Blizzard and Ubisoft, who rake in tons of cash with their existing practices. Here's a great quote from Eric's article worth highlighting. Batchelor is so intent on defending Ubisoft and wagging his finger at gamers that he fails to get to the core of their concerns in the first place. Judging by this article, he fails to even try. It's no wonder he misses the mark so widely. He sees only how this impacts Ubisoft's bottom line and makes the outrageous case that consumers should simply be docile and that gamers should accept whatever changes or progress game publishers want to make to appeal to foreign markets. This is as arrogant as it is short-sighted. The Forbes article then pointed out how Batchelor cherry-picked angry toxic reviews to represent gamers as a whole. It pointed out the ridiculousness of insinuating that the post-backlash adjustment of Mass Effect 3's ending kickstarted this whole movement of angry gamers because the companies gave in to us. And the article ultimately concluded by stating that listening to customers is good for business while demonizing them is not, especially when you're defending censorship and dismissing tangible concerns. As an addendum, Eric noted that he doesn't agree with all the complaints he sees and that some of the outrage does become absurd, but at the same time, the knee-jerk generalization that gamers as a whole are entitled because they react to things is something that bothers him and that he believes creates unnecessary flame wars, especially since the worst and most toxic backlash tend to occur among a vocal minority and are not a representation of gamers as a whole, all of which are sentiments I share. Now, Eric also called out YouTubers for fanning the flames on the other side, specifically citing those acting as a counter-reactionary force to gaming journalism. But games journalists aren't doing themselves any favors by constantly looking down on gamers and YouTubers with offhanded remarks or articles dedicated towards delegitimizing our concerns, and it'd be silly to expect that we're just gonna take that kind of condescension lying down. Not that I believe all journalists are as woefully dismissive of gamers and as sympathetic towards corporations as games industry's James Batchelor or Christopher Doug, as Eric from Forbes himself proved with his more reasonable outlook on the whole situation. But just the same, there are plenty of reasonable YouTubers out there who are having perfectly reasonable discussions and raising perfectly reasonable questions and concerns. If you ask me, there are good and bad apples on both sides, and generalizing each other is the most unproductive thing we can do. But speaking specifically about this particular games industry article demonizing the idea that tangible consumer feedback should be listened to, while supporting the idea of letting censorship, however seemingly minor, slide because it adheres to corporate interests, is just a garbage and short-sighted way to represent this whole situation. These are one man's perspective anyway. I'd love to hear what your take is on all of this in the comments below. With that, I would like to end this news update. Thank you for tuning in. If you enjoy my content and would like to support this channel directly, consider donating on Patreon. And to be further updated on all things gaming news, reviews, and discussions, stay tuned right here on Yong Yeah. I'll see you guys next time. Yong out.